At 6:30 in the evening, deep inside a nuclear missile silo in rural Arkansas, an Air Force technician watched an 8-pound socket slip from his wrench. It fell nearly 80 feet. It struck the steel structure below, changed direction, and disappeared into the darkness. Seconds later, the instruments began reporting something that should never happen inside a nuclear launch complex. The missile was leaking fuel. Directly above it sat a thermonuclear warhead, powerful enough to destroy an entire city. The Air Force had procedures for almost every possible failure, but not for this. Over the next 8 hours, every decision would make the options narrower, the danger greater, and the men sent back inside less certain that the missile was still standing. Then, shortly after 3 in the morning, the silo disappeared in a flash. But the most disturbing part of the Damascus accident was not that one drop tool could destroy a nuclear missile. It was how many people already knew the system was dangerous and kept it armed anyway. In September of 1980, the Cold War was not an abstract political argument. It was buried beneath the American countryside. Near the small town of Damascus, Arkansas, a concrete launch complex held a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile. From the road, there was little to see beyond fencing, antennas, and an enormous steel door set into the ground. Below it stood a missile more than 30 meters tall. Fully fueled, it weighed roughly 150,000 kilograms. If an order ever arrived, its engines could lift the weapon from the silo and send its warhead halfway around the world. The warhead was one of the most powerful ever carried by an American missile. But on September 18th, the men entering Launch Complex 374-7 were not preparing it for war. They were performing maintenance. Dave Powell and Jeffrey Plum belonged to a propellant transfer team. Their work placed them beside the missile's tanks and plumbing, equipment filled with chemicals so toxic that a serious exposure could destroy a person's lungs. They had already been working for most of the day when they were redirected to Damascus. A replacement component had not arrived, so they waited for it to be delivered. By the time they entered the silo, they had been on duty for around 11.5 hours. The task involved removing a pressure cap high inside the launch duct. A recent checklist change called for a torque wrench. Powell realized the tool was still in the truck above ground. For years, he had performed the same kind of work with a long ratchet. Going back for the other tool would take time, and the ratchet was already there. So he used it. The ratchet itself was about 3 feet long. Attached to its end was a socket weighing roughly 8 pounds. But there was a problem. The socket would not lock securely onto the ratchet. Powell held it in position while Plum applied force from the other end. Plum asked if he had it. Powell said yes. Plum released his grip, and as Powell lifted the ratchet, the socket detached. There was an opening in the work platform directly beside them. The socket passed through it. Both men watched it fall. There was nothing beneath it for nearly 80 feet, only the narrow space between the missile and the silo wall. The socket struck part of the steel structure near the bottom. Instead of continuing straight down, it ricocheted toward the missile. The Titan's outer skin was thin because every unnecessary kilogram made a missile harder to launch. The socket tore through it. Immediately, a stream of fuel began spraying from the first stage tank. The mistake had lasted only a few seconds. Undoing it was no longer possible. The Titan II used liquid propellants that could remain inside the missile while it waited on alert. That made the weapon fast to launch. It also meant that a fully armed rocket was permanently storing thousands of gallons of toxic, volatile chemicals inside an enclosed underground structure. The fuel pouring from the puncture could ignite without an ordinary flame if it mixed with the missile's oxidizer. Its vapor was dangerous to breathe. And as the first stage tank lost fuel and pressure, another threat began to grow. The missile depended on internal pressure to help maintain its shape. If the tank weakened enough, The enormous rocket could collapse under its own weight. Fuel and oxidizer could mix inside the silo, directly beneath the warhead. Powell and Plum reported what had happened. In the Launch Control Center, warning lights began appearing. Tank readings moved in the wrong direction. The crew could see that the system was no longer stable, but they could not simply reach over and shut off the leak. The hole was in the missile itself. At 7 o'clock, the commander of the missile wing activated a potential hazard team. Specialists were connected from multiple locations. Engineers, who had helped build the Titan, were in Denver. Senior missile experts were at Barksdale Air Force Base. Strategic Air Command Headquarters was in Omaha. The number of people involved was increasing, but the number of workable options was shrinking. They considered venting the silo by opening its massive closure door. That might allow dangerous vapor to escape. But if the missile exploded with the door open, the blast could throw the warhead out of the silo with no predictable path. Leaving the door closed contained the site, but it also trapped the accumulating vapor underground. By 8 o'clock, the fuel tank readings had gone negative. Some people inside the launch complex wanted to evacuate immediately. Others believed abandoning the control center would mean surrendering the last equipment they might use to save the missile. 2 crew members volunteered to remain behind because, as they later explained, neither had children. They did not believe their lives mattered less. They simply believed someone had to stay. Eventually, the order came to evacuate the complex. The climb out was slow and difficult. The men wore protective equipment. The air was filling with vapor. Visibility was deteriorating, and very little wind outside meant the toxic cloud was settling over the site instead of dispersing. Air Force security personnel began moving civilians away from the surrounding area. Roughly 1,400 residents would be evacuated. Most of them were not told exactly what sat on top of the leaking missile. And back at the complex, one of the most experienced technicians on the scene believed the Air Force was running out of time. His name was Jeff Kennedy. Kennedy understood that no plan could work without accurate tank readings. The pressure inside the missile would determine whether the Titan was still standing or whether it was close to collapsing. So Kennedy entered through an escape route and went down alone. That decision violated one of Strategic Air Command's strictest rules. No one was supposed to enter sensitive parts of the complex without a second person. But Kennedy believed that following the rule would cost time they no longer had. The readings confirmed the danger. Thousands of gallons of fuel had left the tank. The pressure margin was disappearing. Kennedy returned convinced that action had to happen immediately. Then decision-making authority was taken away from the people at the silo. Strategic Air Command Headquarters assumed control. The officers receiving reports from Arkansas had access to engineers, procedures, and the entire command network. But many had never stood inside a Titan complex. Every instruction had to travel down the chain, be interpreted on site, and then carried out by young technicians wearing limited air protective suits. Kennedy wanted to use the escape route again because it was faster. The approved plan required teams to approach through the main portal. That route presented a new series of obstacles. The site's security systems had lost power. A fence had to be cut. An outer entrance had to be forced open. Farther down were heavy blast-lock doors secured by hydraulic pins. Every barrier had been designed to stop an intruder from reaching a nuclear missile. Now the same barriers were slowing the people trying to prevent it from exploding. The first team entered in protective suits carrying only about 30 minutes of breathable air. They crossed the contaminated site, forced the outer portal, and descended through several levels. By the time they reached the first major blast door, their air supply was already becoming a problem. They connected the equipment required to continue, then received instructions to withdraw. Kennedy and Senior Airman David Livingston would replace them. Before leaving for the site that night, Livingston had reportedly told another member of the team that he felt someone was going to die. Now he and Kennedy moved toward the underground entrance. Above them, commanders waited for readings. Below them, the missile had been leaking for more than 8 hours. Kennedy and Livingston passed through the portal and entered the blast lock area. Powerful lights were burning inside. Kennedy was less than 10 feet away from them and still could not see clearly. The vapor had become that dense. Their instruments indicated fuel concentrations at the highest end of the scale. They had the information the command center needed, but remaining underground was becoming impossible. The two men turned back and began climbing toward the surface. Kennedy emerged first. Then another instruction arrived. Someone needed to go back down and activate an exhaust fan. The fan might help remove vapor from the underground structure, but returning meant descending again into a complex filled with an explosive mixture, beside a missile whose damaged tank might already be failing. Livingston tapped his own chest. He would do it. He turned around and went back down. Kennedy remained near the surface. Seconds later, the night became white. The missile exploded inside the silo. The blast launched the enormous closure door into the air and scattered concrete and steel across the complex. Vehicles were thrown. Communications vanished. People miles away felt the shock. For a moment, even senior commanders did not know whether they had witnessed a conventional explosion or something far worse. Kennedy was hurled across the site. When he regained consciousness, his leg was broken and he was badly injured. Somewhere in the wreckage, he could hear Livingston calling for help. Kennedy tried to stand. He fell. He forced himself up again, then fell again. He could not reach Livingston, but he managed to cross the shattered complex toward a vehicle and call for rescue before its radio died. Other technicians heard the broken transmission. When security personnel ordered them away, they continued toward the site because their friends were still there. The launch complex no longer looked like a military facility. Huge sections of concrete lay across the ground. Fire and vapor rose from the place where the silo had been. And nobody on the road outside could answer the most important question: where was the warhead? The explosion had thrown the missile's re-entry vehicle clear of the destroyed silo. Inside it, the nuclear warhead remained intact. Its safety systems had worked. There was no nuclear detonation and no release of radioactive material. That distinction matters. The disaster at Damascus was a rocket fuel explosion involving a nuclear weapon, not a nuclear explosion. But the people responding that night did not have the comfort of knowing the outcome in advance. They had watched a fully armed missile lose pressure, fill its silo with explosive vapor, and disappear in a blast powerful enough to tear apart the complex. Jeff Kennedy survived. David Livingston was pulled from the wreckage and transported for treatment, but he died from his injuries later that day. 21 other Air Force personnel were injured in the explosion or the rescue effort. The public crisis continued after the fire. Local officials and nearby residents wanted to know whether a nuclear weapon had been involved. Under the policy of the time, Air Force officials would neither confirm nor deny that a warhead had been present. Radio traffic revealed teams searching for what they called the unit. For the people listening outside the military cordon, the evasive language made the situation even more frightening. The physical cleanup covered hundreds of acres. Contaminated water was pumped from the ruined silo. The complex was never rebuilt. It was eventually filled and sealed. In the official aftermath, individual violations were easy to identify. Powell had used a ratchet instead of retrieving the torque wrench required by the revised checklist. Kennedy had violated the two-person rule when he went down alone to obtain the pressure readings. Those decisions mattered, but they were not the entire accident. The team had been working an extended shift. The socket could not lock securely to the available ratchet. A missile's thin skin sat beside an open platform with enough unobstructed distance for a falling tool to become destructive. The weapon stored volatile liquid propellants while continuously on alert. The safety barriers that protected it also obstructed emergency access. and the people closest to the danger lost control of the response as authority moved into a distant chain of command. There had even been an earlier toxic leak at the same launch complex in 1978. Damascus was not one careless person defeating an otherwise perfect machine. It was a small human mistake, passing through every weakness the larger system had left available. The Titan II program continued for several more years before the final missiles were removed from alert, and the night in Arkansas left behind an uncomfortable lesson. The more destructive a system becomes, the more people want to believe it can be made completely safe. But no checklist can predict every drop tool. No security door can distinguish between an intruder and a rescuer. And control is not the same thing as safety simply because a control room says it is. The Damascus accident began with a socket slipping from a wrench. It ended with a missile destroyed, a man dead, and a thermonuclear warhead lying outside the silo built to protect it. If you want more true stories about the moment powerful systems stop behaving as their designers intended, subscribe to Meridian Zero and tell me in the comments. At what point that night should the Air Force have stopped trying to save the missile and ordered everyone away?